At the Union Academy, the war with Earth was taught as settled history, the kind that no longer caused debate or strong feeling. It was printed in clean textbooks, shown on neat holographic slides, and repeated every year in the same calm tone. Humanity had fought hard, the lesson said, harder than expected for a young spacefaring species. Their ships were slower, their weapons less advanced, and their alliances few. Still, they resisted longer than most thought possible. Then, at last, they surrendered. The galaxy moved on. The lecture hall was wide and bright, with rows of seats that curved gently upward. Students from many worlds filled the room, their shapes and colors different, but their attention mostly the same. Some listened closely. Some half-listened. Others quietly checked notes or thought about their next class. The war with Earth was important only because it was on the exam. At the front of the hall stood the instructor, calmly guiding the lesson. His voice was steady and practiced, as if he had spoken these words hundreds of times before. He described the final years of the conflict, the supply shortages on Earth, the loss of outer colonies, and the formal message of surrender sent from Earth's leaders to the Galactic Council. The date was highlighted. The treaty terms were summarized. The outcome was clear. Earth lost. A large image hovered above the platform, showing a simplified star map. Red markers showed where human fleets once fought. One by one the markers faded, until only Earth remained, marked with a neutral gray symbol. The image matched the story, resistance shrinking, pressure growing, surrender coming at the end. Most students accepted it without thought. To them the war was distant. It had happened long before they were born. No one in the room had lost family to it. No one had lived through it. It was history, quiet and finished, like a closed book on a high shelf. In the middle rows sat a human student named Aaron. He looked no different from any other human, average height, dark hair, plain uniform, but he sat very still, his eyes fixed on the image above. He had read this lesson many times before, even before coming to the academy. The words were familiar, but they never sat comfortably with him. Around him, students shifted in their seats. One whispered a comment about how humans had been brave but foolish. Another quietly joked that surrender was the smartest thing Earth ever did. The comments were not meant to be cruel. They were said the way people talked about old storms or broken machines. Aaron did not respond. He kept his hands folded on the desk in front of him. The instructor continued, explaining how the galaxy had learned from the war. Humanity's defeat became a lesson in the dangers of rapid expansion and poor planning. It was often used as an example in military and political courses. Fight only when you must. Know when to stop. Do not challenge forces greater than you. The class nodded along. In the back row, a student named Sarah leaned toward her friend and whispered that humans were lucky to still have a planet. Her friend agreed and added that if the war had happened later, Earth might not have survived at all. They both returned their attention to the lecture. Aaron heard them, but he stayed silent. The instructor reached the end of the slide and paused. "This concludes our overview of the Human E-Coalition War," he said. "Next session, we will examine its long-term effects on interstellar law." Several students relaxed, already preparing to leave. The lesson was over. Nothing new had been said. But Aaron felt the familiar weight in his chest, the quiet pressure that always came at this point. The story ended too neatly. Wars rarely did. He thought of old recordings he had watched as a child, of human officers speaking carefully, choosing words with care. He thought of how little detail was ever given about the final months before surrender. He thought of how the phrase, "then humanity surrendered," was always spoken quickly, as if speed made it complete. The instructor began to close his notes. Aaron raised his hand. The movement was small, but it broke the calm of the room. The instructor noticed and looked up, surprised. Human students did not often speak during this lesson. There was little reason to. "Yes," the instructor said. Aaron stood, keeping his voice steady. "Sir, the lesson mentions the surrender," he said. "But it does not mention the final report." A faint ripple of confusion moved through the room. Some students glanced at each other. Others frowned, trying to remember if they had ever heard of such a thing. The instructor paused. His expression did not change much, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "The final report?" he repeated. "That document is classified and summarized in your materials." Aaron nodded. "Yes, sir. But the summary is only one line." The room was quiet now. Even the students who had been half listening turned their attention forward. "The summary is sufficient," the instructor replied. "It confirms Earth's surrender and the end of hostilities." Aaron hesitated for just a moment, then spoke again. "With respect, sir, it confirms the end of hostilities, but it does not explain why." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Questions like that were not common in this class. History here was usually about facts, not gaps. The instructor studied Aaron for a second longer, then answered, "Why does not change the outcome?" Aaron lowered his hand and sat down. He did not argue further. He had said what he needed to say, at least for now. The instructor moved on, officially ending the session. Students stood and began to leave, their conversations slowly returning to normal. Some laughed. Some complained about assignments. The question faded quickly from most minds. But it did not fade from the instructors. As the room emptied, he glanced once more at the slide showing Earth's gray marker. He had taught this lesson for many years. He knew it well. Yet the words, "final report," echoed faintly in his thoughts. Across the hall, Aaron gathered his things and left quietly. His face showed no anger, only patience. He had grown used to waiting. Behind him, the lesson remained written on the board, unchanged. Humanity fought. Humanity surrendered. The galaxy moved on. Most students accepted it without thought. But one did not. The lecture hall was full again the next cycle, just as it always was. Students took their seats in familiar places, some early, some late, most carrying the quiet boredom that came with repeated lessons. The topic on the board was the same war, the same dates, the same calm summary. Nothing about the room suggested that this lecture would be different from any other. Aaron sat in his usual seat, halfway up the rows, near the center. He had arrived early not because he wanted attention but because he wanted time to think. He listened as students around him talked about unrelated things: tests, travel permits, strange food in the lower districts. The war with Earth was not mentioned. To them it was old news. The instructor entered the hall and began without delay. His voice was steady, smooth, and confident. He spoke about interstellar conflicts, about how the human coalition war was often misunderstood by younger students. He explained that bravery did not always mean victory, and that survival sometimes required surrender. His words were clear, well-practiced, and carefully chosen. Aaron listened closely. He always did. As the lecture moved forward, the instructor reached the familiar section. He spoke of the final year of the war, the pressure on Earth, the talks that failed, and finally, the surrender message. The words were almost exactly the same as before. Even the tone was the same, calm and final, like a door being closed. Around the room, students nodded. Some took notes. Some stared ahead without much thought. Aaron felt the quiet tension return, the same feeling he had known since his first year at the academy. He waited. He counted his breath. He reminded himself to stay calm. When the instructor paused to change the slide, Aaron raised his hand. It was a simple action, but it felt loud in the silence. The instructor noticed immediately. He stopped and looked directly at Aaron, clearly surprised. "Yes," he said. Aaron stood, his movements careful and slow. His voice was calm, neither challenging nor unsure. "Sir," he said, "may I ask why the final report is never discussed in class?" For a moment no one spoke. The instructor did not answer right away. He stared at Aaron, his expression unreadable. The pause stretched longer than expected, long enough for students to glance at one another. The instructor cleared his throat. "The final report," he said slowly, "is a restricted document. Its contents are summarized in your materials." Aaron nodded once. "Yes, sir. I've read the summary." "Then you have the answer you need," the instructor replied. Aaron did not sit down. He remained standing, respectful but steady. "The summary states that hostilities ended," he said. "But it does not explain the full conditions under which they ended." A low murmur moved through the hall. Some students looked annoyed. Others looked curious. No one had expected this. The instructor folded his hands behind his back. "History classes are not the place for classified speculation," he said. "I'm not speculating," Aaron replied. His voice did not rise. "I'm asking about a report that officially closed the war." The instructor's eyes narrowed slightly. He had faced many students before, some aggressive, some emotional, some eager to prove themselves. Aaron was none of those. That unsettled him more than open defiance would have. "No one else has raised this concern," the instructor said. Aaron met his gaze. "That doesn't mean it's not worth asking." The room was completely silent now. Even the students who usually ignored lectures were watching closely. Some felt uncomfortable. Others felt something new, interest. The instructor took a slow breath. "The final report is not part of the approved curriculum," he said. "It confirms the surrender. That is its relevance." Aaron paused, then spoke again. "Sir, if it only confirms surrender, why is it restricted?" The question hung in the air. The instructor did not answer immediately. He glanced at the board, then back at Aaron. His calm tone wavered just slightly. "That will be all," he said. "Please sit down." Aaron hesitated for a brief moment, then nodded and returned to his seat. He did not look upset. If anything, he looked relieved, as if he had finally spoken a thought that had been building for years. The instructor continued the lecture, but the rhythm was broken. His words came slower. He skipped a slide. A few students noticed. When the session ended, the room buzzed with quiet conversation. Students stood and talked in small groups, many glancing at Aaron as they passed. Some whispered questions. Some shook their heads. A student named Lily caught up with Aaron near the exit. "Why would you ask that?" she said, not unkindly. "Everyone knows how the war ended." Aaron looked at her and smiled faintly. "Everyone knows how it's told," he said. "That's not always the same thing." She frowned, confused, but he was already moving on. The instructor remained behind after the hall emptied. He stood alone at the front, staring at the darkened board. Aaron's words echoed in his mind, especially the last question. "Why is it restricted?" He turned toward his console and hesitated. Accessing restricted archives was not forbidden, but it was discouraged without cause. Still, he told himself, academic curiosity was a valid reason. He entered a secure request code. The screen flickered, then displayed a warning. He hesitated again, then confirmed. The words, "Final Report, Human Conflict," appeared on the screen. The instructor leaned closer, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet focus. He had taught this war for years, yet he realized now that he had never read this document in full. As the first lines appeared, his expression slowly changed. Back in his quarters, Aaron sat alone, reviewing his notes. He knew he might be called in. He knew he might be warned. He accepted that. He had not asked the question to challenge authority. He had asked it because history mattered, and because silence often hid important truths. No one else had ever asked that before. But now, someone had listened. The change did not happen all at once, but it did not stay quiet either. At first, it was only whispers. Students who had been in the lecture spoke softly to friends in other departments. They chose their words carefully, unsure how much they should say. Some feared they had misunderstood. Others feared they had understood perfectly. "There was a report," one student said in a dining hall line. "The real one." Another replied, "I heard. It wasn't defeat." "Not really." By the end of the cycle, the whispers had turned into questions. Why was the final report sealed? Why did the timeline not match the public story? Why did humans surrender after winning control of the war itself? Study groups stopped talking about exams and started talking about Earth. Messages crossed between dorms, labs, and research halls. Screens glowed late into the night as students searched for old data, fragments of records, anything that might confirm what they had seen. Some were angry. Some were confused. Some were excited in a way they did not fully understand. Aaron noticed the change the next morning. As he walked through the academy halls, conversations slowed when he passed. Not out of fear but attention. A few students nodded to him. One even thanked him awkwardly as if unsure why. He did not respond much. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He had only wanted the truth to be spoken aloud. In the history wing, instructors gathered in small groups, their voices low. The lesson from the previous class had already reached them. Some dismissed it as a mistake. Others demanded access to the same report. A few sat quietly thinking. One senior instructor said, "If this is true, then our framework is wrong." Another replied, "If it is not taught, it is because it was not meant to be understood." "But students understand it now," the first said. That was the problem. Across the academy, reactions varied by species. Some students from older spacefaring cultures struggled the most. Their histories were built on conquest and surrender, clear lines of victory and loss. The idea that a species would choose to end a war while holding advantage felt uncomfortable, even suspicious. A student named Paul argued during a discussion group, if humans were strong, they would have claimed control. That is how peace is enforced. A student from another world replied quietly, or that is how peace is delayed. Others began to look back at past interactions with humans and see them differently. Trade agreements that seemed overly cautious. Military treaties that focused more on limits than power. Human diplomats who spoke often about long-term stability instead of short-term gain. It began to form a pattern. Humans did not rush. Humans did not threaten. Humans planned far ahead. In the academy library, records that had once seemed boring gained new attention. Students found references to supply systems failing at the same time across wide regions. They noticed how quickly the war ended after that point without a final massive battle. What once looked like collapse now looked like control. The word defeat slowly lost its meaning. In common spaces the tone changed. Jokes about human weakness faded. Casual comments grew careful. Students began to ask humans questions instead of making assumptions. Aaron was stopped one afternoon by a student named Sam, who had once laughed during the old lectures. "I didn't believe it at first," Sam admitted. "But the data lines up." Aaron nodded. "Truth usually does." Sam hesitated. "Why didn't you tell everyone sooner?" Aaron looked down the hall before answering. "Sometimes people need to ask the question themselves." As days passed, the academy administration could no longer ignore what was happening. Attendance in history lectures rose. Requests for archive access increased. Official channels filled with polite but firm questions. Why was this report sealed? Who approved the narrative? What else was simplified? The administration released a short statement, careful and neutral. It said the final report was under review and that academic discussion was encouraged within proper bounds. That was enough. For many students, the shift was not about politics or blame. It was about respect. They began to see humanity not as a species that failed, but as one that made a difficult choice and accepted the cost of being misunderstood. That kind of restraint required confidence. It required strength that did not need to prove itself. In one open forum, a student said, "If they could end a war without finishing it, what else are they capable of choosing not to do?" The room went quiet. Faculty members began adjusting their language. Phrases like human defeat were replaced with human withdrawal or conflict conclusion. It was subtle, but it mattered. One instructor admitted privately, "We taught the easy story." Another replied, "Easy stories do not prepare students for reality." Aaron continued his studies as before. He did not seek attention, but it found him anyway. Students asked for his thoughts, his perspective. He answered simply, never exaggerating, never boasting. "We're not special," he told them. "We just know what war costs." That honesty carried weight. Over time, something else changed. When discussions turned to future conflicts, students began asking different questions. Not who would win, but how would it end? Not how much force, but how much damage lasts. Humanity's example had shifted the frame. Respect did not arrive as applause or praise. It arrived as pause, as thought, as caution. Old assumptions faded quietly. Humans were no longer seen as lucky survivors of a lost war. They were seen as the ones who had stepped away while still holding the power to stay. And that made the galaxy listen. Years passed, quietly and steadily, the way deep change often does. The academy remained where it had always been, its towers rising above the city, its halls filled with new students each cycle. To anyone passing through, it looked the same. But inside its lessons, something important had shifted. The history texts were rewritten slowly, line by line, after long review and careful debate. At first the changes were small. Words like defeat were removed. Phrases were softened, then replaced. Dates stayed the same, but meanings changed. Eventually the chapter title itself was revised. The Human Coalition War was no longer labeled a loss. It was described as a conflict concluded by deliberate action. In classrooms, instructors spoke differently now. They no longer rushed through the final years of the war. They paused. They explained. They showed the full timeline, including the actions once hidden behind sealed archives. Students listened with a focus that earlier classes had never known. They learned how Earth had studied the war carefully, how human leaders had measured not just victory but cost. They learned how systems had been disabled instead of cities, how control had been taken without claiming ownership. They learned that the final surrender had been a decision, not a collapse. The lesson was no longer about who stood tallest at the end. It was about who chose to stop. Aaron was no longer a student by then. He had graduated quietly, without ceremony beyond what was required. He had refused special attention, turning down offers to speak publicly about the past. He believed the truth spoke best when it was allowed to stand on its own. He worked now in a small research office, helping organize historical records so that future students would not have to search so hard for what mattered. He liked the work. It was careful, patient, and meaningful. Sometimes, new students would recognize his name in the archives. "You're the one who asked the question," they would say. Aaron would smile faintly and reply, "I just noticed something missing." The academy placed a short inscription near the main history hall. It was not large or dramatic. Most people walked past it without stopping. Read. History changes when someone asks why. Inside the lecture halls, discussions grew deeper. Students debated ethics, responsibility, and restraint. They spoke of power not as something to use but something to manage. Humanity's choice became a case study, taught alongside great treaties and turning points. The war was now described as the moment humanity ended a conflict forever. Not because no fighting followed anywhere in the galaxy, but because that specific war never restarted. The systems that had fed it were gone. The anger that had fueled it had nowhere to return. Former enemy worlds rebuilt, slowly, often with quiet human support. Trade replaced tension. Borders softened. The fear that had once driven fleets into space faded into memory. Other species began to adopt similar thinking. In later conflicts, leaders asked different questions. They looked for ways to stop wars rather than win them outright. They spoke of exit paths and final outcomes before the first shot was ever planned. Humanity's influence spread, not through force but example. At the academy, a new generation of students filled the seats where Aaron once sat. Among them were humans, learning about their own past with the same careful tone as everyone else. There was no pride in the lesson, only responsibility. One instructor, newer and younger, paused during a lecture and looked out at the room. "Remember," she said, "strength is not proven by how long you fight. It is proven by knowing when you no longer need to." The students wrote it down. Far from the academy, Earth continued its quiet work. It did not claim leadership of the galaxy. It did not demand recognition. It simply remained consistent, steady, and watchful. Those who understood no longer underestimated it. Years later still, a revised textbook opened with a simple line. The war did not end because humanity lost. It ended because humanity chose a future where it could not begin again. Aaron read that line once late in the evening and closed the book. He felt no triumph. Only calm. A single question asked at the right moment had changed how history was told. And because of that, how the future was shaped. Word spread through the academy faster than anyone expected. It did not move through official messages or public announcements at first. It moved through quiet talks in hallways, through late-night discussions in shared rooms, through short messages passed between friends who trusted one another. Students spoke carefully, choosing words that would not sound dramatic, yet unable to hide the weight of what they had learned. "There's more to the war," someone would say. "It wasn't what we were taught," another would reply. By the next cycle, almost everyone had heard something. Some had seen the report directly. Others had only heard pieces of it. But even fragments were enough to cause doubt. The simple story of defeat no longer fit. In the dining halls, tables that once held light conversation now carried serious talk. Students compared timelines. They pointed out gaps in the old lessons. They asked why key events had always been rushed or skipped. A student named Tom stared at his screen during lunch and shook his head. "If this data is correct," he said, "then Earth controlled the war before it ended." His friend replied slowly, "Then surrender wasn't weakness." That idea felt strange at first. Many students resisted it. They had grown up believing surrender meant failure. It was a clean rule, easy to remember. Letting go of it felt uncomfortable. But the facts did not disappear. In study groups, old notes were rewritten. Words were crossed out. New questions filled the margins. The phrase human defeat appeared less often, replaced by terms like strategic withdrawal or deliberate conclusion. Human students noticed the shift quickly. Where once they had been ignored or lightly mocked, they were now approached with questions. Not accusations, not challenges, but real curiosity. How did humans decide when to stop? Did everyone agree with the choice? Was there fear of being misunderstood? Aaron answered when asked, but he never exaggerated. He spoke plainly, just as he always had. "Humans argued a lot," he said once. "They still do. But most agreed on one thing. Endless war helps no one." Some students struggled with that answer. Others found it deeply unsettling. In military theory classes, instructors began noticing changes in discussion. Students no longer focused only on power and numbers. They asked about long-term effects, about what happened after a war ended, about how peace was kept. One instructor paused during a lesson and said, "You are asking different questions than students did before." No one denied it. Faculty meetings grew tense. Some instructors welcomed the change. Others worried about its impact. A few feared it challenged the authority of long-held records. One senior instructor argued, "If humans were capable of more, why hide it?" Another replied, "Maybe because power does not always need to be displayed." The debate spread beyond history departments. Political science, ethics, even engineering courses felt the effect. The idea that restraint could be stronger than force touched everything. Students from other species began re-evaluating their own histories. They saw moments where wars had continued simply because stopping was seen as shameful. They wondered how much damage could have been avoided. Slowly the word defeat lost its sharp edge. It became clear that humanity had not been pushed into peace. Humanity had chosen it while still holding the advantage. That realization changed tone. Respect did not arrive loudly. There were no celebrations or praise. Instead, there was a quiet adjustment in behavior. Students listened more carefully when humans spoke. Their words carried weight now, not because they were louder but because they were measured. A student named Jack admitted during a group discussion, "I used to think humans were reckless fighters who got lucky. Now I think they were careful planners who walked away." No one argued. In the Academy archives, access requests increased. Students wanted primary sources, not summaries. They wanted to see what had been hidden. The administration approved some requests and delayed others, but the pressure did not fade. The truth had momentum now. Outside the Academy, news began to leak. Academic journals published cautious papers. Analysts asked questions that had never been asked before. Political leaders avoided the topic publicly, but privately they paid close attention. If humanity had ended a war without claiming victory, what else had they chosen not to do? Back at the Academy, old assumptions continued to fall away. Humanity was no longer viewed as a minor power that survived by chance. It was seen as a species that understood limits, its own and others. That understanding frightened some and reassured others. Aaron felt the change most clearly in small moments. A nod instead of a stare. A question instead of a joke. A pause before judgment. He did not correct people when they praised humanity. He did not encourage it either. He believed respect only mattered if it was honest. One evening he sat alone in a quiet corner of the library reading. A student he barely knew sat across from him. "I used to think peace was what happened when someone lost," the student said. "Now I think peace happens when someone decides to stop winning." Aaron looked up and nodded. "That's closer to the truth." As cycles passed, the Academy adjusted fully. New lessons were drafted. Old language was removed. The story of the war was no longer about failure but choice. What was once called defeat was now understood as restraint. And restraint, many began to realize, required a strength that did not need to prove itself. Respect replaced old assumptions. Not because humans demanded it, but because the truth made it impossible to deny. Years passed slowly at the Academy, yet quietly and completely, the way time moves when nothing obvious changes but everything is different. New students arrived each cycle and old students graduated and left. The halls, classrooms and towers looked the same from the outside, but inside the lessons had begun to shift. What had once been told as simple history now carried a deeper meaning, a careful understanding that stretched across the galaxy. The history texts themselves were rewritten but not all at once. At first a few lines changed. Words like defeat were removed and replaced with strategic conclusion or calculated surrender. The language softened where it had once been harsh. Dates remained the same and events were still listed in order, but the meaning beneath them was now clearer. Students no longer read only the outcome. They were asked to consider the choices, the reasoning, and the long-term consequences of actions taken. Instructors spoke differently now. Lectures that once rushed through the last months of the war lingered on the details. They explained Earth's actions with care, showing how human leaders had measured not just victory, but the cost of continued fighting. They highlighted the moments where humanity could have pushed further but chose to step back. For many students, this new perspective was surprising. For some, it was inspiring. For a few, it was unsettling, forcing them to question the ways they had been taught to think about power, victory, and responsibility. Aaron no longer sat in those classrooms. He had graduated quietly, with no ceremony beyond what was required. He had never sought attention, preferring to let facts speak for themselves. His question from years before, simple, steady, and respectful, had already begun to ripple through the Academy, far beyond what he had imagined. He continued his work quietly in a small research office connected to the Academy archives, organizing records so that future students would not have to search so hard to find what mattered. It was careful work, requiring patience, precision, and thoughtfulness, all things he valued. Occasionally, new students recognized his name on records, in lectures, or in discussions about the changes in curriculum. They approached him with curiosity. "You're the one who asked the question about the final report," they said, almost in awe. Aaron would nod quietly and reply simply, "I just noticed something missing." That was all. No boasting. No pride. Only truth. The Academy had placed a small, understated plaque near the main history hall, A line of text that many students walked past without noticing. History changes when someone asks why. Those few words carried more weight than any formal lecture or award. They reminded every student that curiosity, careful observation, and courage to question even accepted facts could reshape understanding. Over time, discussions in classrooms deepened. Students debated not only what had happened but why it had happened and what lessons could be applied in the future. They talked about restraint, responsibility, and the careful exercise of power. They examined the consequences of endless fighting, the importance of measured decisions, and the subtle difference between winning a war and ending one. Humanity's choice became a standard example in lessons across the academy, showing that victory was not always measured by who remained standing, but by who ensured that future generations would not have to fight at all. The Human E-Coalition War was no longer a story of defeat. The revised lessons told of a species that had ended the conflict deliberately, that had chosen to step back at the right moment, and that had protected countless lives and systems while holding the advantage. The war became known as the moment humanity ended a conflict forever. It was a quiet, calculated victory, one that did not rely on spectacle or conquest, but on intelligence, patience, and moral clarity. Former enemy worlds rebuilt, not under pressure, but with assistance offered quietly by humans. Borders softened. Trade and cooperation replaced fear and suspicion. The systems that had once fueled war were no longer operational, not because they had been destroyed, but because humanity had removed the possibility of their misuse. Peace had become permanent, not by force but by careful planning and foresight. Other species began to apply these lessons in their own strategies. Leaders asked not just who would win but how a war could end responsibly. They studied not only the cost of fighting but the consequences of stopping at the right moment. The example set by humanity reshaped diplomacy, politics, and military thought across the galaxy. Where once victory had been measured by who could destroy the other first, it was now measured by who could secure a lasting peace. Aaron watched these changes quietly. He did not intervene. He did not instruct. He observed. He felt no pride in the spotlight. Instead, he felt satisfaction in the steady spread of truth and understanding. What had started as a single calm question in a lecture hall had grown into a movement of thought, a shift in how history and future choices were understood. He remembered the moment he had raised his hand in class years ago, the look of surprise on the instructor's face, the hush that followed. He remembered speaking simply, without argument, asking only about the final report. That question had quietly changed the perception of an entire species and, over time, had changed history itself. The academy continued to grow and evolve. Students learned to think critically, to question carefully, and to value understanding above pride or fear. The lessons about humanity's war were no longer a chapter on loss but a chapter on wisdom, strategy, and moral courage. Instructors told the story with respect, showing not only what had happened, but why it mattered and how choices could shape the future for generations. Late one evening, Aaron sat at his desk, reading the revised texts. He saw his name referenced in a footnote, mentioning the student who had asked the question that brought the final report to light. He smiled faintly, not out of pride, but because the change had finally reached a steady place. The story was now told truthfully, responsibly, and completely. The war did not end because humanity lost. It ended because humanity chose to stop the fighting when it mattered most. That choice became an example that traveled through the academy, across star systems, and into the minds of every student who learned that history could be more than dates, battles, and treaties. It could be a lesson in thoughtfulness, responsibility, and restraint. A quiet, steady truth had replaced old assumptions, and the galaxy learned to listen in a new way. Humanity was no longer remembered as a species that failed. It was remembered as one that ended a conflict forever, without arrogance, without force, simply because it knew what the right choice required. And all of this began with one calm question in a classroom, asked by a student who only wanted to understand what had been hidden, and who had changed history by daring to ask why. Even after the textbooks were rewritten, the changes were felt more in conversation than in formal lessons. Students discussed the war with fresh eyes, asking questions their predecessors never thought to ask. In dormitories and lecture halls, in cafeterias and common areas, debates took on a new tone. What had once been a story of defeat was now a story of careful, deliberate action. The idea that a species could wield strength not by fighting harder, but by knowing when to stop, fascinated everyone. Some of the older species struggled with the concept. In their histories, victory had always meant power, domination, and survival at all costs. The thought that a species could hold the upper hand yet choose peace felt alien, almost incomprehensible. Yet as students studied the revised lessons, the evidence became undeniable. Systems had been disabled, fleets neutralized, but no unnecessary destruction occurred. Humans had prevented the war from continuing, yet they had left lives and infrastructure intact. The restraint was almost surgical in precision, and it demanded respect. Faculty members watched this shift with careful attention. Some whispered privately about the influence of Aaron's question. The simple inquiry, why the final report was not taught, had forced a chain of investigation, leading to the full understanding of Earth's final strategies. They had debated quietly among themselves, wondering how one student could have caused such a profound change in the academy. Many admitted, reluctantly, that it was a rare moment in academic life when curiosity altered history itself. Aaron rarely spoke in these discussions. He continued his work quietly in the archives, organizing records, cataloging newly approved reports, and ensuring that students would have direct access to the facts. He liked the calm of the archives, where information spoke for itself, free from interpretation or drama. Occasionally, students would seek him out, eager to hear a human perspective on events that had long been misrepresented. Aaron would answer carefully, never exaggerating, always precise. "The records show what happened," he would say. "History is not a story of heroes or failures. It is a story of choices." Over time, his approach became an example for others. Students learned that questions could be more powerful than answers. They learned that understanding required patience, attention, and courage. And most importantly, they learned that the way history was recorded mattered just as much as what actually happened. The influence of the revised lessons spread beyond the academy. Former enemy species began to reconsider their own histories and policies. If humans could end a war by removing the possibility of further conflict rather than by conquering, then perhaps other wars could be approached differently as well. Diplomats and strategists began to study Earth's example, asking how restraint could be applied without sacrificing safety or sovereignty. Military planners began considering not only how to win, but how to stop a war permanently, and how to prevent unnecessary suffering. In one political conference, a high-ranking officer from another species remarked privately to a human delegate, "We once thought your people were reckless fighters. Now we see you as careful and deliberate. That is unsettling." The human delegate smiled quietly. "It's not about power," she said. "It's about responsibility." Back at the academy, discussions of ethics, strategy, and moral choice became central to nearly every department. Students in engineering programs studied human systems thinking. How fleets were coordinated, how logistics were disabled without unnecessary destruction, how decisions were based on long-term outcomes rather than short-term gain. In law courses, the principles of restraint were discussed as foundational to diplomacy and international conduct. In philosophy classes, students debated the morality of victory without destruction, of power exercised quietly, of strength measured in control rather than force. Aaron observed these discussions quietly. He did not claim credit. He did not ask for recognition. To him, the important part was that the truth had changed minds. Students and instructors alike were thinking differently because one question had been asked. One student had dared to wonder what was missing. The academy eventually held a formal review of its own curriculum. Committees of instructors, historians, and administrators studied the effects of including the final report in lessons. The conclusions were unanimous. The story of the war could no longer be told as simple defeat. Instead, it had to emphasize the careful decision-making, the restraint, and the strategic end of conflict. Future generations of students would learn not only dates and outcomes, but also the reasoning, the choices, and the moral clarity that had guided humanity. Even the phrasing of tests and assignments changed. Students were asked to analyze human strategy in a way that went beyond numbers and fleet sizes. They were asked to consider long-term consequences, to weigh the ethics of action versus inaction, and to recognize that restraint could be as decisive as force. Essays, debates, and projects were filled with discussion of humanity's choice to end the war without escalation, to neutralize systems rather than destroy worlds, to surrender in form but not in essence. Humanity's story became a model for the galaxy, an example of what could be achieved when strength was combined with wisdom. Other species began to adopt similar approaches in their own conflicts. Fleets were built with consideration for both defense and deterrence. Treaties were drafted not only to end hostilities but to prevent their return. Diplomacy emphasized compromise and foresight rather than domination. The influence of a single species' restraint spread in ways that no battle could have achieved. Aaron occasionally walked through the academy halls and observed students interacting. They asked questions of each other politely, weighing answers carefully. They debated strategy and ethics without fear of ridicule. He saw the change not in grand speeches but in small moments. A student helping another understand a concept, a group pausing to think before responding, a discussion that focused on understanding rather than judgment. It was subtle but profound. One evening he passed by the main lecture hall and noticed a new plaque had been installed, small and unobtrusive, just as the original one had been. The inscription read, "History is not only what is remembered, but what is understood." Aaron paused for a moment, then continued walking. No one noticed him. No one had to. The words were enough. Years later, when he returned to review the archives, he found the final report had been fully digitized and integrated into the official curriculum. Students no longer had to request special access. They could see every detail, study every decision, and understand the reasoning behind humanity's choices. The story of the war was no longer about who lost or who won. It was about how a species ended a conflict responsibly, how choices could shape history, and how restraint could protect lives and systems alike. Aaron looked at the digital files one evening and reflected. He thought of the first time he had raised his hand in class, the quiet confidence that had made his question matter. He thought of the instructor's surprise, of the silence that had followed. That single question, asked calmly and respectfully, had changed not just a lesson, but an entire understanding of humanity's place in the galaxy. He realized that history is not just recorded by events, but by those who notice the gaps, who ask the right questions, and who are willing to challenge assumptions. One question, one observation had rewritten what generations would know. Humanity was no longer remembered as defeated. It was remembered as careful, deliberate, and strong in a way that did not need to dominate. Across the galaxy, analysts, leaders, and historians referenced the lesson again and again. They discussed it in conferences, in research papers, and in quiet offices where strategy was planned. The story of Earth's restraint became a benchmark, a model, a guiding principle. Humanity's name was spoken with respect, not fear, not pity, not mockery. Respect. That was the change. Aaron smiled faintly as he read notes from new students analyzing the final report. They debated scenarios, imagined consequences, and explored ethics. They questioned not only the past but also the future. They considered how they would act if placed in similar circumstances. The seeds of thoughtful decision-making were spreading. Even in small ways, the lessons were reaching far beyond the academy. Policies, treaties, and peacekeeping strategies across multiple species were being influenced by the principles that humanity had demonstrated. Leaders studied not only Earth's military history but also its restraint, the way it could act decisively without destruction, the way it could protect systems, lives, and futures while holding the advantage. Aaron returned to his desk, quietly satisfied. He had not sought recognition. He had not sought reward. He had only noticed something missing and asked a question. And that question had changed how the galaxy understood the past, how it measured strength, and how it imagined the future. The war no longer stood as a story of loss. It stood as the moment humanity ended a conflict forever. And every student, every historian, and every leader who learned that truth owed it, in some small way, to a quiet human who dared to ask why.